Now we come to our main guest for today. She was elected as a Green in London before it was fashionable to do so, and she sat on the London Assembly for a decade, holding Sir Sadiq to account primarily on the environment and transport, of course, amongst other issues. In May, she assumed the role of chair of the London Assembly Transport Committee and immediately launched an investigation into an issue that could revolutionise the way that we travel around the capital. In fact, listeners and watchers at home may have already received a notification on their Uber apps asking them to express interest in trialling one of these. Of course, it's the issue of driverless cars and taxis. In recent weeks, experts, TfL officials and representatives from such firms have been hauled in front of the committee and Assembly members to probe the question of whether London is ready for so-called robo-taxis and what impact they're going to have on the city going forward. Caroline Russell, welcome to Inside City Hall.
Thank you.
Can you just start by describing why you decided upon this investigation in particular? Of course, we've heard companies, firms like Wayve are hoping to roll out these taxis by the end of the year. Do you think this is overdue in a sense?
Well, I think, obviously all over London, people are seeing autonomous vehicles being trialled on our streets. So people are interested in what they are. They're being used in different ways. So, you can use the technology to provide a taxi service, which is the same as taxis with drivers, except without a driver. But you can also use it to provide public transport, and I thought it was really important, and so did the committee, that we look into this, see what the regulation process is, because it's completely new, and at the moment the government has taken control of regulation away from TfL, and so we thought there were a load of questions we needed to ask about, what was happening, how quickly these vehicles might be operating on our streets, and what the regulation processes were in place and whether they were strong enough. So those are the kinds of questions that we've been looking at.
Now, before we get into the detail, I think I just want to start by talking about the concept of driverless cars. At the end of the day, they are cars on our roads. They're not public transport, and I guess neither you nor the mayor are particularly in favour of added congestion and added single occupancy vehicles. And of course, the mayoral transport strategy promotes active transport. Wants 80% of journeys to be walking, cycling or public transport by 2041. Do you think the idea of driverless cars, of robo-taxis, runs contrary to that principle?
I think there's a lot of questions in there that you've raised all in one go. The mayor's transport strategy is very, very clear that the majority of trips in London, 80% by 2041, need to be made by walking, cycling and catching the bus or a tube or train. And so anything that worsens congestion is going to make those buses less attractive, and therefore will reduce the likelihood of the mayor hitting that target. So there are really serious questions about what impact any kind of rollout of driverless vehicles, whether they're being used for public transport or whether they're being used for autonomous passenger vehicles. It's the question is what impact is that going to have on our transport system, and are we really thinking about all of those impacts? And certainly the congestion point is really serious, because when they're empty they drive around looking for passengers, and that's there's not even a driver inside. That's really not great to have empty vehicles filling up our streets. So there's a lot of questions about how it could work.
Because that's one of the things that was raised in one of the initial committee sessions, that this could just be another range of sort of another Uber in a sense, just coming onto London's roads, which, as you say, are already very heavily congested, already discourage the taking of public transport due to reduced bus speeds, etc. I guess that's kind of a major fear.
Well, I think it really depends what TfL does. If TfL gets hold of this and says, oh, this is interesting technology, I wonder whether we could fill in some of the public transport deserts in outer London with a service that's maybe some kind of a bit like a bus, but a bit like a taxi, but that connects in with public transport apps like they do in Oslo, then you could imagine there potentially being some real public benefit from using that technology. But if we're talking about simply creating a lot more traffic and also potentially putting a lot of people out of work, because we saw what happened to the black taxi trade when Uber came in with that disruptive app-based private hire model, and now if we have a driverless private hire model, then that also could have really disruptive impacts on employment and so on an awful lot of people's livelihoods. You know, there's 100,000 private hire drivers in London, and so clearly they're also really concerned about this.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned Oslo there. Obviously, while London is one of the first cities to adapt these vehicles, obviously Oslo was a bit ahead of the game, and there seemed to be a lot of praise from experts on how they've handled it in particular. What kind of aspects did they do that could easily be adopted by, I guess, the government and also TfL as well?
Well, I think they started out by thinking, you know, about the public purpose of their transport system and how they could deliver the best services, particularly for the people who had least access to public transport. And I think that's the bit that's really important. We need to be thinking about how this technology does it have a role to play in improving the access to transport of every Londoner, and particularly the Londoners who have least access to public transport or to transport at all in London. So that's the people on the lowest incomes and the people living in the places with the least public transport options. Is there something that this technology can do that would actually make their lives better?
Do you think there is a need for it in London, in a sense? I mean, there's no shortage of taxi drivers, and there's no shortage of, obviously the black cab industry has reduced, but there's been a rise in sort of Uber and Uber drivers.
Look, at the moment we haven't yet reached any of our conclusions. We've heard so much evidence from taxi and private hire drivers, from experts, from people in San Francisco who've regulated autonomous passenger vehicles. We've heard from Oslo. We've heard from Transport for London. We've had a conversation with the government team that are regulating these things. So we're processing everything at the moment. But I do think that public purpose and thinking, what can this do for London and our London transport system, rather than thinking about what can it do for the people who are wanting to make money out of it, is, you know, that it's got to have a public value that comes from it if it's going to have a useful purpose in our city.
And of course, you and the Transport Committee were lucky enough to have a go yourselves in some of these vehicles. I was on the visit, but unfortunately they weren't letting journalists in the cars at the time, hopefully in the future. But going into that, I mean, what did you think going into it, having experienced the idea of a driverless car? Admittedly, it did have a driver at the time because it's not considered safe enough to do so. But what was your thoughts going in, and then I guess coming out? Was any of your concerns alleviated?
Well, I think sort of, you know, it's interesting because on that visit I learned a lot about the different kinds of autonomous vehicle technology that's being trialled on London streets. So Wayve, which was where we were visiting, are teaching their vehicles to read roads. And when I was sitting in the vehicle, for instance, we came up behind a cyclist, and I was expecting the vehicle to maybe try and overtake, but it didn't. It just hung back at the cyclist speed, didn't do, there were a few places where maybe a car being driven by a human might have tried to overtake, but actually it would have been a tight squeeze. And so I was really glad to see that the vehicle waited behind. We got to the traffic lights and then we went straight through the traffic lights. It just meant we didn't wait so long at the traffic lights when we got there. So from that point of view, that's a kind of driving behaviour that is really helpful on the streets. If you've got vehicles that are sticking to 20 miles an hour and are not dangerously overtaking, that's a good thing, because it makes everybody safer, and it means that people who are riding bikes are going to feel confident to ride their bikes, ride with their kids to get to school or whatever. So that was reassuring, but I think it was basically quite dull, a bit boring. You were just basically sitting in a car that drove absolutely just underneath the speed limit and obeyed every single traffic rule, and that was quite dull and reassuring. But some of the vehicles are learning in a different way, and those are being fed lots of maps, and I think that's when they get in a bit of a tangle. So you kind of hear about driverless vehicles kind of all getting stuck in a cul-de-sac and having to reverse out and beeping late at night, and because they're reversing and because they've just got confused or they haven't understood a road sign. Or there was a crash the other day where a autonomous vehicle knocked a motorcyclist off their bike, and it seems to have been that there was confusion about how the traffic lights worked, because there were, when you get traffic lights where it's red for the traffic going forward but green for the traffic turning right or something, and I think it was a sort of confusion about the layout of the lights that caused that collision. But that is that was one of the vehicles that is learning by ingesting maps rather than learning by understanding how to read the road. So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of which kind of AI technology these cars are being controlled by.
Yeah, there's still obviously a lot of work to do, both from the companies and I guess also by TfL and DfT. I mean, the whole, concept of this, part of this investigation was, is London ready for it? And just from your engagements with, whether it's asking the mayor in mayor's question time or in front of TfL officials or the mayor's team, what has your engagements been like? Is there a sense of they are on this, or is there kind of almost a reluctance to engage?
Again, I've got to be really careful because we're not yet reaching any of our conclusions. And I'm speaking for a cross-party committee here, but I think the regulation of all of this is being controlled by the government, which feels like they have stepped in on London's devolved powers, because London should be, we license private hire taxi drivers. TfL should have a licensing role in this, and I think we're all a bit surprised at the way that, because this is a new technology, the government has been controlling these trials and giving permission for the trials without TfL having any say. So I think you've touched on something that is going to be a really gritty bit of the report, where we're going to be really digging into the detail of how all of that works and making sure that TfL stands up for the devolved transport powers that London has, and make sure that that TfL manages the whole transport network, and they really should have a say in what, how the regulation works, what kind of data the companies give, what rules around the way the vehicles work. We haven't even talked about engagement with emergency services, which the trials in London have seen one vehicle drive through into a live police cordon, and we heard from San Francisco about first responders trying to engage with an empty autonomous vehicle that had driven into a live firefighting situation. They'd driven over a fire hose, and actually it taking several minutes to be able to get any kind of engagement with the company that was controlling the car. Now, you don't want anything, you don't want the emergency services who are fighting a fire to be trying to work out how to deal with a car that doesn't have a driver in it. So there's all sorts of issues around that London's got to get on top of before this sort of anything gets unleashed on our streets.
Absolutely, and a survey commissioned by your committee reveals that Londoners aren't quite on board yet. It was 42% are sort of against the concept of autonomous passenger vehicles.
17 was it?
I think 29% in favour, which is still a majority against. So it's quite important for, I guess, policymakers to bring Londoners with them on this journey, because otherwise, I guess there is a sense of fear. I mean, some of the concerns raised was not only about the way that these autonomous vehicles would deal with emergency situations, like you say, but also how firms would handle data and aspects like that.
Yeah, there's the concerns about what happens to data and all the safeguarding stuff about if someone's in a vehicle and there's coercive behaviour or even assault, or if there's a medical emergency in a vehicle, how does the answers that we got in committee on those questions were not brilliant. It's almost like they hadn't really been thinking about that, and actually, as a public body, TfL needs to make sure that all that safeguarding is really properly in place. And now, there was one other thing that I was going to say, but it's completely disappeared from my mind, so...
No problem. Last question on my part is about, obviously, talk about driverless cars, perhaps putting drivers out of work. And this has actually played itself in the London Assembly. I remember several taxi drivers interrupting a London Assembly session with representatives from Waymo and Wayve. I mean, obviously, they're concerns are very understandable.
Completely understandable, and we'd literally heard from them the Friday before that meeting. We'd had representatives of taxi and private hire vehicle companies in to talk to us so that we could hear, and we spent a couple of hours hearing all the different concerns that they were raising, and in particular the concerns about loss of jobs and the impacts of that, both for the broader economy, if you've got fewer people paying national insurance, but if you've got people who've been earning their money through private hire driving, and then they're out of work, then you've got you've got people who are not able to kind of make that contribution into the local economy in London as well. So there's that. But it's absolutely understandable that people are really, really concerned, and that's certainly one of the things that we are absolutely thinking about. There needs to be, if there's going to be any kind of rollout, there needs to be real attention paid to a just transition, to making sure that people have access to retraining for good jobs. There's also the issue that for anyone who is disabled or older, they may well need a driver to help them get into the car, to help them get out of the car, to help them see what's happening outside the car when they get out. So the idea of a driverless taxi may be quite appealing for someone who is young and fit, and literally they told us in committee that your phone immediately connects to Spotify. Well, for many older or disabled Londoners, they may not even have a phone that can connect to Spotify. They may not have a phone that can connect them to using an autonomous vehicle. So I think we really need to think about the workers' rights side of this, but also, as the taxi and private hire drivers made very clear to us, the role of a driver is in terms of making a taxi journey or a private hire journey accessible is really, really important. And obviously in London, all our taxi and private hire drivers are DBS checked. So, we know that we're doing everything as a city we can to ensure that those drivers are safe. So I think, there's a lot of questions in there before, we see a lot of these cars on the road.
No, absolutely. It's such a multifaceted kind of issue that no doubt we'll dissect more and more in the future, and I can't wait for your committee's eventual output on this and the recommendations.
Yeah, no, well, I can't wait for the report either.
Absolutely. Caroline, thank you so much for appearing on Inside City Hall.